I'm Jenny Turner. I'm from West Des Moines, and public schools are really important to me. I went to public school in Iowa, and I had the opportunity there for music education that I really connected to, kept doing it in college even. Met my husband through that. He was a public school band director, and I got to watch kids go through his program and connect with it. He took a band to Lincoln Center, and they met a bunch of jazz legends. And I'm a school speech therapist. I've seen kids from many different backgrounds with different abilities, most of whom probably would not have been able to get speech therapy at all if it weren't for public schools. And I have gotten to see some of my kids with significant disabilities hanging out in the student section at games with like the popular kids, and they're just all together having fun. It's pretty great. And then my own 14-year-old goes to public school. He has had friends who live in million-dollar homes and friends who live in the income-subsidized apartments. So income inequality is not like an abstract concept to him. His friends are different races. Their families have come from different parts of the world. They have different religions. Their families have different politics. And, you know, that's an education that he can't get anywhere else. He has had teachers give opinions about things that he's come home, we've talked about research together, and he decided that that was wrong. So he is thinking for himself. Public education is community. It's knowing each other. And it's the heart of democracy. But here in Iowa, Kim Reynolds has been doing the bidding of Betsy DeVos and the Heritage Foundation in dismantling our proud tradition of public education with vouchers for those already in private school, poor funding, destruction of our special education system, and attempts to demoralize our teachers when they try to teach honestly and let kids think for themselves. Public education is vital to our democracy, so we are trying to support it and defend it. Our keynote speaker this year is a history teacher, a teacher of the year, a former member of the North Carolina State Board of Education, an executive director of the Center for Racial Equity in Education. Please join me in welcoming Dr. James E. Ford.
Good afternoon, Iowa friends. How are we doing? I bring you greetings from North Carolina, but I should mention that I'm a native of Illinois. So I'm a blue-collar Midwesterner at the end of the day who just migrated to the South, but nevertheless, super excited to be here with you all today. And I want to give a special shout out to CCI. Yeah, make some noise. Because I am super excited for you all and to have the pleasure of being able to hopefully offer some insight, but more importantly, drum up some excitement about the movement ahead and the work that we have to do. So as mentioned, I am at heart a high school history teacher. I was, all right, yeah. I had the good fortune of being the North Carolina Teacher of the Year in 2014. But I, unfortunately, no longer in the classroom, but my work is in education policy, and I am the founder and director of the Center for Racial Equity in Education. But I hope to be able to talk to you today about the work going on in North Carolina, contextualize that in history. I'm sorry, I'm a teacher at heart, and so I gotta pay homage to my profession. Anchor that in some themes, because what's happening historically is also happening locally and nationally. Talk to you about where this is coming from and what we can do about it. And so if you'll indulge me for a few minutes, I want to talk to you about this notion of protecting our public schools, our last stronghold of multiracial democracy. As stated from the outset, I want to talk about where we are right now, this political moment, because some of us may be confused about where we find ourselves. We may be wondering where and how did this come about. And to me, that's the job of a history teacher, is to let us know where we are existentially and to map that out. And I want to talk to you about a personal philosophy of mine, which is that history rhymes. Okay, history rhymes, and I believe it's rhyming again. I want to talk to you about the playbook that's being deployed and break down some key plays. It's not a big playbook. It's maybe like a two-sheeter, right? It's just tried and true strategies that have proven effective. I want to talk about the long game and then this notion of the blue pill and who wants us to stay asleep in Alaska. Talk about taking action, what we've been doing in North Carolina, and what you all can do here in Iowa to continue fighting back and activating protection of our public schools. So, where are we? You know, I have this thing that I used to begin all my history classes with, and it was a diagram. It looked just like this. And it was an illustration that essentially posited that, in my mind, history as a study is actually not a line. It is taught as a line, and in a linear fashion, you kind of get a series of dead people and dates. And you're supposed to get excited about that. But to me, and from my orientation, I instead viewed history more as a circle or as a cycle, if you like. In that way, the past is actually prologue, and whatever has been will be. And if you pay enough attention, you can start to discern some of the patterns and the themes, and they aid you in being able to predict what's going to happen next. And so, in a lot of ways, it's much like a map, as I stated, or even a clock, letting you know what time of day it is, letting you know where you are existentially. And so, I want to offer the same thing to you and asking the question, where are we? And the truth of the matter is, if we're being honest, we talked about being courageous and telling the truth, we are in very perilous times. Times that require a response and an awareness of what is unfolding. And I will confess that I'm often accused in discussing this matter as being a little too morbid, too dark of my assessment of things. But I'll be honest, and I'm not being arrogant here, I haven't been wrong a whole lot either. Okay? The truth of the matter is this. You've seen it. We've been in a drastic slide toward fascism. You've seen the rolling back of things like, say, affirmative action, the demonization of so-called critical race theory and CRT and the book bans, right? And the attacks and attempted outing of trans students, lacking of those protections of the LGBTQ community. All of these things are part of an escalation that seemed like it came out of the ground in 2021. I know because I was on the State Board of Education when it happened, and we were revising our history standards in the state. And suddenly, this notion of critical race theory came up, and I thought it was odd. As an academic, I was familiar and literate with critical race theory, but I had never heard anyone introduce it in these conversations. And then suddenly you saw the numerous book bans and memory laws that were attempted to be passed, and you realized this was a part of something larger. This did not spring out of the ground. It was part of a movement, an AstroTurf movement, very well organized and very well funded. And so when I say things like we're sliding toward fascism, I don't want to be accused of being hyperbolic here. And so I want us to just take a moment to operationalize some definitions here, okay? So when you look at this is Webster's dictionary, okay? When I talk about fascism, that may sound bombastic, but when you really look at this definition, a political philosophy, movement, or regime such as that of fascisti, that exalts nation, often race, above the individual, and that stands for a centralized autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader, severe economic and social regimentation, and forcible suppression of opposition. Secondary definition, a tendency toward or actual exercise of strong autocratic dictatorial control. Thank you. And so when we look at this definition, I hope that it's sobering. I hope it calls us back to the reality of what's actually occurring. It's not just that bad policies are being forwarded. They are part of a groundswell of something much larger that is characteristic and frankly not unprecedented. It's very much in line with human behavior that governments do when they can no longer easily control populations. And so that is where we are. That is the political moment, and we need to be unafraid to call it what it is in this environment. It's a slide towards fascism and authoritarianism. And so even as we talk about democracy, there's not universal agreement amongst all of our fellow Americans around even that principle. And we have to be honest about that. The other thing is that, as I mentioned, history is a cycle, and I think that history is rhyming again. You know, you start to see certain patterns, right? You start to see that these things reanimate and recycle themselves. They occur again and again in a different context, a different time period, a different population, but the same stuff essentially keeps popping up. And I have discerned a pattern, a very simple one, of action and reaction. The actions tend to be actions that, in my opinion, denote significant progress. One could look no further than the Reconstruction era. And if you all aren't familiar or haven't gone to history class in a while, United States history, Reconstruction was the era, the 12-year period that happened right after the end of the Civil War. And by many historical accounts, was probably the most progressive era of U.S. history in many, many years. You go from the abolition of slavery to all throughout the South in the former Confederacy, formerly enslaved folks not only established the right to vote, not only established free public schools, but also are elected to their state houses and even into Congress. Unprecedented changes. Only for 12 years did this last before a campaign known as the white supremacy or disenfranchisement campaign, where the immediate response was to take back the state houses, segregate the school systems, underfund them, and then to undermine voting rights. I say again, history is rhyming, action and reaction. It laid the groundwork for a concept that I'll talk about a little bit later called minority rule. And it's a simple concept. Probably haven't thought about it under that moniker, but minority rule came out of this era. But even more than that, you all, many of us don't know that there were also movements for the reformation of how we teach history in the early 1900s. We know now that February in the United States has been recognized as Black History Month. For those who don't know the history of that came from an individual, only the second Black man to get a PhD from Harvard. His name was Carter G. Woodson, from a native of West Virginia, actually. Grew up in Virginia. His parents were enslaved. And he made it his business to learn more about people of African descent. He knew that the education that he was receiving was not only inadequate, it was incomplete. And in trying to teach more about the history of Black peoples, not just in the United States, but across the world, he hoped that the school system would adopt more inclusive histories, and of course they did not. And so when they did not, he created his own supplementary documents. And he created a cultural response in Negro History Week to focus on learning about Black people, which ultimately turned into Black History Month. And he created the Association for the Study of Negro History and Life, now known as African American History and Life. And so Carter G. Woodson was the founding father of the Black History movement. In North Carolina, even in the early 1900s, there were our Black Teachers Association was working and advocating for many of the same reforms: curriculum equity, more inclusive histories in the early 1920s, and advocating to our state board of education. And so the notion of creating a more inclusive canon of history, one that doesn't just represent one segment of the population and exclude others, is not new. And even as we recognize the scholarship of Carter G. Woodson and all that he did and the great forward-thinking approach of that, immediately there was also a counter movement that some of us may not be familiar with. How many of us are familiar with an organization called the United Daughters of the Confederacy? The UDC. This is a neo-Confederate organization with its roots in Nashville, Tennessee. And these are folks who descend from former Confederate soldiers. And you know what they did? They made it their business to propagate a lie. They were so disgruntled about the loss of the Civil War that they created their own propaganda. And you know what they said to themselves? They said, we didn't really lose. Because it was a noble cause that we were fighting for. In fact, it's just a lost cause. And it wasn't really a civil war. It was a war of northern aggression. And what they did was not simply to say these things. They organized themselves all throughout the South, and they targeted local school boards. And anytime they saw a textbook or any curriculum materials that offered a narrative that was not aligned with the lost cause, and we say that off the tip of the tongue, we all know what that was. They're responsible for propagating the lost cause idea. They protested at state boards. They protested at local school boards. I say again, history is rhyming. That sounds eerily similar to an organization right now. I can't think of their name. Moms for something for liberty. I don't know. But I tell you again, history is rhyming. You had action, and then you had a reaction. And, the same thing is that we're experiencing right now. I say again, this did not come out of nowhere. This didn't come out of the clear blue sky. What's happening even right now is a continuation of a response to the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, probably the most impactful Supreme Court decision in terms of changing the landscape and giving America its best chance at having multiracial democracy. But everybody was not excited about that, including folks in my state. I learned in studying that after Brown versus Board happened, that our governor, two governors actually, one died in the middle of this, Governor Umstead, created a committee headed by one of the House members, Thomas Pearsall, and he created a plan. It was called the Pearsall Plan. This plan essentially undermined desegregation by allocating funds, listen to this, allocating funds, public school funds, to white students and threatening to shut down schools and defy integration and allow them to go to private schools. It is the historical predecessor of what we now know as vouchers. And it was a direct response to the mere notion of integration. I want to let you know that historically, that's where this whole thing comes from. This is not new. These are strategies that may have not worked, that they just have kept on plugging away at. And now we're seeing them finally coming to fruition. The Pearsall Plan in North Carolina was relatively unsuccessful. But what I'll tell you is that it was also met with the threat of violence. It was used. This actually is a quote from a Klan rally in North Carolina, not too far from Charlotte, where an attendee says, if the Pearsall Plan doesn't work, the Smith and Wesson Plan will. You constantly hear the threats of violence that accompany these very regressive reforms. I'm telling you that that is historically in line with what we have observed time and time again. This is not new. And again, the virtue of historical thinking is that if we can understand what has happened in the past, we can literally be ahead of the curve next time it comes around. North Carolina is not the most extreme example of this. In Prince Edwards County in Virginia, and if you want to take notes and research and fact check anything I'm saying, I would encourage you. Prince Edward County in the early 1950s also had a very similar plan, identical. When one state would adopt something, another state would adopt something very similar. It was almost like they were working in concert with each other. But in Virginia, they went further, and they clean shut down Prince Edward schools for close to 2 years. They refused to integrate, and so students were actually denied, black students and white students, of going to school, and they had a voucher system as well, where they took those monies that were allocated and sent them. And the proliferation of private schools, literally, if you look at a timeline, coincides with Brown versus Board of Education. Private school attendance and private schools go up right at the same time Brown versus Board of Education. That is not coincidence. So again, that's the context we're talking about here. And in truth, you know, when you look at action and reaction, when you think about what's happening right now, it actually is not very surprising, is it? Like, we're actually kind of due. You know, you think about it. You have the civil rights movement, you have the first black president, you have gay marriage, you have protests of summer 2020, tearing down the Confederate monuments. It's a predictable response from a group that feels like they're losing their way of life and that the old America is gone. It makes sense. The country, in truth, has changed, but it's not the existential crisis that the far-right extremists make it out to be. Change is inevitable as a part of any nation's evolution. Resistance to the shifts in composition and culture that we oftentimes call the culture wars, it's a mistake. And it's trying to maintain predominance instead of plurality. It's this idea that numerous things can't coexist harmoniously at once. And we have to reject that premise at every turn. This notion that America will no longer be America without white Anglo-Saxon Protestant social and cultural dominance is FUBAR. It's not a zero-sum game, right? But to them, that's how it is. There's no power sharing. You're either oppressor or oppressed. You're either dominating or you're being dominated. There is no in between. And if I'm being honest, I think that particularly when it comes to education, we got too comfortable. We assumed that the progress that was gained in generations past was solidified. We assumed that the inevitability was somehow going to reinforce itself and that we didn't have to fight. But to quote Angela Davis, freedom is a constant struggle. We have to secure the freedoms over and over again, and that's what we're being called to do in this moment. On to the playbook. Here's the deal about education, and what I love about it is that education is, frankly, revolutionary. It's radicalizing. In my own personal research, as I studied, the history of black education, I realized that in the South during slavery, each state outlawed the ability for enslaved people to read. Why would they do that? Because they knew. And they even articulate in these laws, they knew that to gain access to literacy or numeracy makes one unfit to be a servant. It incites rebellion. And so be very clear. These are not earnest attempts to make sure you teach all sides of the issue, whatever their latest line is. They know that the more access to information people get, the more they'll start to question. Education coming from the Latin root educar, which means literally to lift up or to pull out. It's an act of moving someone out of the darkness and into the light. The supposed objective truth and an aversion to relativism or approaching issues from multiple perspectives is anchored in the idea of incontestable, irrefutable facts, free of interpretation or any kind of bias. And that's just not a reality. This so-called indoctrination that everybody keeps throwing around is actually resistance to even teaching or familiarizing students with concepts that, at the root at all, that are any different from the regular canon. It's an attempt to miseducate children. The actual definition of indoctrination is the process of teaching a person or group to accept a set of beliefs uncritically. Makes you wonder why they're constantly protesting against critical this or critical that. Okay? So it's trying to prevent kids from asking the big questions, y'all. They don't want young people asking questions like, why are people poor? Or why is there suffering? Why are some countries more powerful and others aren't? Why are people of a darker hue all over the world dealing with subhuman conditions? How did our country amass so much wealth, become so powerful? Why are some people guaranteed rights and others are not? That's what this fight is about. And it's anchored in a really low self-concept. Because if folks were really confident in who they were, they wouldn't be trying to force everybody to think, look, and act like them. You can tolerate people who are different. A liberal bias going on. And this is the playbook that some of y'all may recognize. I'll run through the plays really quickly, but how many of y'all were around for the 2008 election? Right? You guys remember this, right? Do y'all remember long ago when Jeremiah Wright went viral? Right? With these comments right here, I'll let you read them for yourself. And when these comments were taken out of context, I might add, and proliferated on news channels all over the place, they were played nonstop, 24-hour news. Part of the playbook. And it forced a response from then candidate Barack Obama, who was my senator at the time, and he had to essentially distance himself from these comments, okay? Didn't matter if they were taken out of context or not. If he had any chance of winning, he had to do that because they targeted a particular demographic. He strongly opposes pastor, right? Denounces defamatory remarks. What was happening here? What was the play being run? This is the play, essentially. To mischaracterize Jeremiah Wright as un-American and to play clips, right, that really were, these views, I'm going to be honest, are kind of solidly in the mainstream of a lot of black thinking across America. There's nothing revolutionary about them. The demographic they were targeting specifically was white Americans. Okay? That demographic. Accused Barack Obama of being a radical, which we hear that all of the time, and then urging Obama to denounce him and hoping that would have electoral consequences. Okay? And it did essentially work, right? The same playbook got ran with the CRT stuff, okay? And in fact, there's no better example than that of the principal down in Texas, James Whitfield. They accused educators of indoctrination of students with CRT. Again, scaring primarily white Americans, parents in particular, and policymakers. Accused anything even approaching racial equity as being extreme, and then urging districts to abandon racial equity efforts, and it worked. In Texas, where James Whitfield, in the area of Texas where he's from, where he was the first black principal ever, or superintendent ever, community members started speaking out and saying that they disagree with him because of his extreme views. The man hadn't even been in the job for a couple months. And lo and behold, what happened? The board proposed not to renew his contract, and he was ousted. Why is this important? Because they've been running the same plays for the past 100 years. And while we haven't caught up and figured out how to counterpunch is beyond me, but that's what time it is. That's why we're here today. No longer, how many times you get punched and be on your heels before you kind of go on offense, all right? These things, they mutate. You can run the play over and over again. They just spawn into new things. They get used for the memory laws, Parents' Bill of Rights, school vouchers, anti-DEI, book bans, anti-CRT, it's the same thing over and over and over again. So the more we can see this pattern, the more we can be able to combat that. Who's behind it? Well, I'm glad you asked. Who's behind it, y'all, is it's a network of funders, right-wing funders, to be transparent. They use the information, they use the money to fund think tanks that smuggle these ideas and give the veneer of scholarship. So that you think these can't be radical ideas. These are coming from very scholarly, smart people with honorifics in front of their names. They put in a policy brief. Then the advocacy groups coalesce around them and push these ideas out to the grassroots and then use parent organizations as props. Feel free to take a photo of this. The book that was the most revealing to me. How many of y'all have heard of Project 2025? I'm so happy folks have heard about that, but to be honest, this is more like Project the past 100 years. I'm glad that we found something singularly to organize ourselves and point to, but this has been in the works for much longer than that. This is beyond one presidential election, okay? Nancy McLean makes it super duper clear in her book, Democracy in Change, that this is a 70-plus year strategy that they're unfolding. They've been planning ahead for decades, and they've been using right-wing think tanks like the Cato Institute, like the Heritage Foundation, like the Manhattan Institute, where Christopher Rufo works, to smuggle these ideas out and to make them more mainstream so that people won't think that they're as radical as they are, and appealing to the rational ignorance of folks who really just trying to understand things. They don't have a whole lot of time to investigate super deep. They're trying to live and make it from day to day. But that's how things that used to be radical become more palatable. It's organizations like this. Christopher Rufo, and if you all are not familiar with him, I don't want to give him too much credit, but he's kind of seen as the mastermind of the anti-CRT and the mastermind of the anti-DEI stuff. And what I will give him credit for is Chris is just calling out the plays in real time. He's not creating this. He's just letting you know what we're going to do, what's going to happen, and he's narrating it as it occurs. And to that, he deserves credit. But his framework, this is his framework. You start with the narrative, which I talked about, right? Like the clips. You change the conversation. You talk about whatever this is. You make it a boogeyman. You make it a pejorative. You call people woke. You call people whatever the case may be. And then you get some financing behind it to be able to push it out. And then you squeeze it out with the political. You find actors who are in the state house or actors who are in Congress who can enact those changes. But the fourth part that he mentions, not quite as part of his framework that I had to point out, is the invisible, is centrist liberalism. He makes clear that they target people on the center left because he views them as their primary audience. He knows that if they pressure them enough, that they'll eventually capitulate, and they'll start to weaken their commitment to things like social justice, things like racial equity, things like trans rights. And so that's important as we do this organizing work to understand who is the target of a lot of these campaigns. It's actually the center left. And he says this. He says, once my position, which began on the right, became the dominant position across the center left, I knew that it was just a matter of time before we were going to be successful. Let this inform what we're doing here, right? This is not to castigate our friends in the center left, wherever anybody's at. It's to understand the key demographic who's being targeted. Our folks right here, in case you're wondering, just want to provide a map. Okay. And then there's this idea of populations being replaced. Okay? You will not replace us. Anti-Jewish sentiments, anti-black sentiments, anti-immigrant sentiments, they're all working together to create this toxic environment that we're in right now that's finding its way across everywhere, but also, most especially, the public school system. Red pillars. I always think this is funny, right? Because, thing about it is everybody's saying the red pill, oh, you need to wake up. They're actually selling you a blue pill and telling you it's a red pill. Okay? But my question is, there's nothing wrong with being woke. The question is, who wants you asleep? So this is it. The long game. I'm gonna tell you the long game, and then I'm gonna tell you the strategy to win, and then we're gonna get out of here and I'm open up for questions. What is the long game? People have asked me. Why would they do this? Why would you undermine public schools? What do they possibly get out of this? Why would you privatize education and drain money from the public sector? Because when you think about schools, y'all, you close your eyes and you think about how schools look in other nations, developing countries. You think about schools that are often, say for instance in Africa, that may be underfunded, where there is not a public infrastructure to support education as a right. You think about the same thing maybe in Latin America, where if you don't have school fees, you don't get to go to schools that offer the prime level of education, or even parts of South or Southeast Asia where that's the case, right? Where if you don't got the money, you're not privy. That's exactly the type of system they're trying to create here in the United States of America, where those who have money are primed for leadership and aristocracy, and those who don't got the money are left with whatever they can scrape up. That's the picture of what they're trying to create. So how we take action? In North Carolina, we've been fortunate to work as a part of a national initiative with Race Forward and to form a coalition. My organization, the Center for Racial Equity in Education, is one of 3 organizations alongside Down Home, North Carolina, and the Education Justice Alliance. And we are together known as Heal Together North Carolina. HEAL, of course, is an acronym for Honest Education, Action, and Leadership. And this has been our catalyzing moment to say, you know what, it's time to offer a counterpunch. The opposition is not smarter, but they are louder. The opposition has been heretofore more organized, but now that we know the playbook, how do we offer a counterpunch? And so through this work in North Carolina and recognizing many of the same things that are happening here in Iowa, where we haven't had school district closures like y'all have in Orient, or things of that nature, but we have vouchers and money being siphoned away. And so we've decided that we have a theory of action that essentially says that we're gonna work locally. Since that's where most of where the targeting was happening, and local school boards actually have a huge policy implication, a lot of power to change things, why don't we start organizing and showing up at our local school districts? Why don't we just activate local chapters? It's my timer. Why don't we start activating local chapters? Why don't we start pulling together folks that we know are informed or at least care about the issues and start showing up with our t-shirts on, with prepared speeches, and starting to weigh in? Because as of right now, all of the oxygen is being taken up by the opposition, and that only happens because we allow it to. Enacting a local actions, but a statewide apparatus, statewide movement. So finding ways to aggregate our power at the regional and at the local level, but ultimately culminating in a statewide movement, where now it's not just one isolated group over here in the southwestern part of the state or in the north central part of the state or in the Piedmont, but we're all working actively towards the same issues, but showing up and talking at local boards in a localized and in a region-based way, and connecting our movements. That's part of why I'm here, because ultimately y'all are launching a similar campaign for Public Schools Strong, and I'm your cousin from North Carolina. Common messaging, common tools, common tactics. That's how we build power with each other. And we're taking this thing national. It may have started in North Carolina, and it may have started in our context, and there are things that are specific to Iowa that you have to respond to, and they deserve to be responded to in a localized manner. But this has to be a movement, not an AstroTurf movement, but a truly authentic grassroots movement to take back power. Because we recognize what time it is, and we're not gonna sit back on our heels and allow fascist takeover of schools or other essential industries, essential institutions. Public School Strong is that campaign. It's our way of saying, you know what? Everything that's being pervaded is a lie. And calling a lie, right? Telling the truth, as they used to say when I grew up in the church, telling the truth and shaming the devil. It's about destroying the lie. It's about making it clear that in the real world, we actually need each other. That no person in the real world is actually an island. That rugged individualism and all that, it has its place, but it cannot be used to deprive the populace of what they need and is their right to have. That just because we fight for social justice, that doesn't make us socialists. Just because we believe in the common good, that doesn't make us communists, although by doing that, you're making it sound pretty cool. We're actually humanists. That honest education is not indoctrination. That yes, there are multiple sides to any issue or any story. That banning books is not freedom. Outing trans kids is not parental rights or school safety. And the best way to build a multiracial democracy and to ensure shared prosperity is actually still through making sure that our public schools are strong and not sending money to private academies. This is our call and our response in the moment in the way that we secure the freedoms that generations before us did. And guess what? When we achieve victory, we're gonna have to do it again in the next generation. Because that is our call. But we're gonna be here until the lights get turned off. All right, thank you so much for your time.
Let's give it up for Dr. James E. Ford. Make some noise, people. All right, we got a couple minutes for some questions. A few rules. The Q&A, the Q in Q&A stands for question. It's not a P&A, it's not a preach and answer, it's not a commentary and answer, it's a question and answer. So, I know I'm seeing hands, So I'm gonna start over here with Susie Petra. Here, Susie, I'm gonna let you, Ava's got a mic for you. I also wanna tell you, we've asked staff to hang on to those mics. I know it's a test. Good organizers hang on to the mic. Sorry, that's how we test our staff. That's right.
Do you have some initiatives for our next possible president and vice president when it comes to federally supporting our schools stronger than they've been?
That's a great question. The difficulty with that is that actually, and this is where folks get tripped up, education is technically a states' rights issue. It's not in the enumerated powers in the Constitution. That doesn't mean that the Fed should not play a role. I believe that there should be substantial investment in subsidizing teacher salaries, right? So that it doesn't matter what state you belong to, there's not so much variance in low pay for teachers, right? And if there was some way we could actually change the composition of our Congress, I think we should actually make education a right, right? We should make education. That's my big, hairy, audacious goal.
Thank you. Another question, D'Artagnan Brown, and then we'll get Mandy after D'Artagnan.
Thank you. Thanks for your talk. Boy, oh boy, did we need this. I'm wondering, in your work down there, what have you done or what have you noticed, I guess, about getting the parents who before probably weren't showing up to support their own? How are you dealing with that aspect of it at all, getting parents back in the game?
Simple conversation. I entered a workshop earlier today where they were role-playing, having discussions, rapport building through one-on-ones and getting people to actually start to take pride people actually like, if you poll, people actually like public schools. They like their public schools. And then you ask them about how schools are terrible. Do you like yours? Yeah, mine are great. It's really odd, right? And so getting folks to take more pride in their local public schools, and then also tapping into the fact that when they demonize public schools, for a lot of us, how many of us are public school alums? They're talking about us. They're talking about us. So even if they're not parents, just community members, getting them to identify with public schools and to start to get involved through rapport building has been hugely important.
Thank you. Mandy.
Yes, with so much of the school policies being under state control, as you mentioned, I'm finding that even those of us that live in the more progressive parts of the state have school boards that feel that their hands are tied. My child still cannot participate in sports. My child still cannot use the bathroom closest to their classroom, even though the school board wants to allow that. So I believe that this is a fight that is winnable in Iowa. I am wondering that while we are working on that higher policy level, what individual community members and communities can do to mitigate the harm that is happening before we get those policies changed.
And that's difficult even in North Carolina too, right? Because the State Board of Education supersedes the authority of local boards. And in those situations, it's difficult. And so it's a both and. I think we have to start local because there actually is more autonomy than we recognize, right? So it's not to rest on our laurels, but we also have to effectively organize and advocate at the State House and transparently in electoral seasons right now where we can actually change the composition of the folks who sit in those seats, because so much of the potential to change rests on who's there, right? And so during election years like the one we're in right now, that's the hardest push for changing state level policies, changing out who the legislators are.
Thank you. We got to take one or two more. Vanessa?
Oh, sorry. See, that's why. So I'm child free. So I want to know, like, how to get over like that mental barrier that my husband and I may have, of like, well, we don't have kids that go to public school, so like, why should we be there? And I mean, it matters to me, but yeah, like, right, we're like subsidizing it, right? But like, how do, I don't know, a way of thinking to get over that and be like, oh, I need to plug into this because it's going to affect me.
Find another issue that doesn't seem like it's directly connected to education. Talk about crime. Ask questions about the drivers of crime. Why do you think people commit crime? For fun? Maybe they're teenagers. Usually it's, it's economic related. And why can't they just make more money? Well, maybe they're not as educated. What would qualify one to get an increased wage in most cases? Greater education. Well, then we should really make sure that folks have access to education as a way of mitigating crime, right? So they're finding indirect routes to issues that are actually very connected to education but don't seem like they are on the surface, is the way that we make it more apparent and more tangible for folks. That takes work to do, but it can be done.
Sure. Absolutely. That's great. We'll do one more.
Have you written a book, or are you planning to write a book that deals with this issue of protecting public education?
It's really interesting you asked me that. I'm actually, Lisa knows this, I'm actually on sabbatical right now. And so this is the only thing I've done in a few months. And my father passed away about 3 weeks ago, so I've been taking some time to myself. But one of the things I committed to doing during this time was I think I'm gonna write a book about this. Like, I can talk about this, so.
Excellent. Well, with that note, thank you. Let's give it up for Dr. Ford.